All right, next question. Hey Merja, I love your four people within model and I've been using it for a while now. I've heard you refer to the shadow functions in similar terms, for example, shadow inner parent, shadow 3-year-old inner child. My question is, how can we use the language of adult, parent, and inner children with our shadow functions? How does this framework transfer? Okay, so I think I understand what you're asking. So I'm going to answer your question the way that I think that you're asking it. So when we talk about our shadow self, first of all, let me give you a little bit of history on it, because this is there's a lot of confusion around this online in particular, and a lot of that confusion. Sorry, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying that I want you to understand what I'm saying, that what we talk about when we talk about the shadow functions or the shadow self. So actually, Carl Jung himself thought of the shadow side as our 3-year-old inner child, what we call our 3-year-old inner child, so like our blind spot. And that's as far as personal development had got to at that point when he was talking about that. Now, fast forward some decades, several decades, nearly 100 years, and we are talking about other things. We're talking about, the so-called inferior function, which is now the 3-year-old inner child. But I wouldn't even call it inferior, because it's not really our inferior function. Because if we look deep enough into ourselves, we will find all 8 parts of us. So there's 2 ways that we make decisions, thinking and feeling, and there's 2 orientations on each. So inward thinking, outward thinking, inward feeling, outward feeling. So that's 4 possibilities. And then we have 2 ways that we collect information. There's intuition and sensing. And both have 2 orientations, inward and outward. So inward intuition, inward sensing, outward sensing. So that's the other 4. Now, those together are 8 different functions, 8 different parts of us that we can have. And everybody has both inward and outward facing thinking, inward and outward facing feeling, inward and outward facing intuition, and inward and outward facing sensing. But we have a strong preference to one of each of those orientations. So one of the thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. And the predominant ones that we have are our 4 people within. And the other 4 are in our shadow. And how the shadow kind of translates from the light version of ourselves to the more actualized version of ourselves is that I'm an INFJ, so my adult self is an inward-facing intuition. And that means that my shadow adult self is outward-facing intuition. My light inner parent is outward feeling, which means that my shadow inner parent is inward feeling. My 10-year-old inner child in the light is inward thinking, which means that my shadow 10-year-old inner child is outward thinking. And my light 3-year-old inner child is outward sensing, which means that my shadow 3-year-old inner child is inward sensing. So with that kind of framework, if you like, in mind, we can start looking at some point, we can start looking at our shadow side, our shadow self. And people ask me, how do I do this? How can I get to know the shadow self? I don't actually recommend that you start looking at the shadow self or trying to discover about the shadow self, because the shadow self will bring itself to you. Those 4 shadow functions, those 4 shadow people within will bring themselves to you in different situations if you are aware. So I recommend that you always focus on the 4 people within. And then when you begin to see the flip side So if you have introverted intuition, when you start recognizing yourself, you're so familiar with your inward intuition that you start recognizing yourself turning it outward. That's when the door has opened into your subconscious mind that holds the outward intuition in there, and then you can start exploring it. But until you notice it, looking for it is just going to confuse your four light people within. So there are a lot of people who want to do like a spiritual bypass, where they think that if they understand a concept intellectually, that then they've actualized it, but that's not actually what happens. You don't actualize anything without practice. So that's why it's so important that we get into that space where, you know, we get so familiar with the four people within that then the orientation flips itself, and then we start really exploring the shadow side. So don't treat this as any kind of competition of, oh, I'm working on my shadow self, so I'm further along than you are. You working on your shadow self doesn't actually mean anything other than you're looking at your shadow self, and it doesn't mean anything about anybody else. And once you get to a certain level of personal development, you realize that everything is actually really simple, and everything as the simple as the simple concept just takes a different form. And it's no longer about who knows what. It's about, oh, I want to share this experience with somebody. So that's what I would say about the shadow side. So I hope that explains how the shadow functions come about. So it's basically the opposite orientation of your light function. So if your adult self is introverted, your shadow adult self is extroverted. But it's the same function, the same job. So if it's intuition, it's intuition. If it's thinking, it's thinking. If it's feeling, it's feeling. If it's sensing, it's sensing. It just changes the orientation. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on shadow work? I'd love to hear. Okay, that's all the time we have for today. We had a couple more questions that I didn't have time to address today. Now we are going to move into, as I said, to the monthly forum format. So we won't be doing these weekly anymore, but not to worry. We will get to these, and keep sending in your questions, and we will continue to help you as much as you can, or we can, and as much as you need to, because we want to make impact. We are all about the impact. So if you're going to be missing the weekly Q&As, just get in touch with us and see how you can come into the organization and contribute. Maybe you want to be a brand ambassador for the four people within. Maybe it's helped you a lot. Maybe you're interested in becoming a mentor. Get in touch with us. desk@marysimilov.com. I'd love to hear from you. All right. You have a really fantastic day, and I hope you have a good weekend, and we will talk to you soon.